News, and joining me tonight to have a look at the best stories from tomorrow's newspapers, the broadcaster James Max and the political consultant from Insight PA, Ollie Kendall. Gents, good to see you. Ollie, let's kick off with you and the Times and all this hospitality that certain people are getting.
Yeah, certainly. Mandarins challenged on hospitality culture, says the front page of the Times. This is a story of the scale of the entertainment disclosed for the first time that the senior civil servants in Whitehall have been enjoying over the last year. Apparently they're not stuck in their ivory towers, they're actually venturing down. They're going to some of the nicest restaurants and bars across London. They're being hosted by some of the big consultants that are sort of national and London based. And of course this is very much of a lobbying story, really. Is it appropriate for these very senior civil servants in government to be lobbied by obviously very senior people within business? And there's a great thing, if you've got the graphic of it, from the Daily Mail on page 5. And the chap who they highlight for the most hospitality is a guy called Sir Brian Bender. He's the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Business, Enterprise and Regulatory Reform. Has a wonderful list of all of the engagements that he has been to, paid for by the private sector in the last year. He's been for dinner with Ernst & Young, he's been to lunch at PricewaterhouseCoopers, he's been for breakfast with GKN, and there's a great picture of him here. He looks very slender given all the meals he's had. But my favourite bit about this particular article is that it's got at the bottom of this a staff accompanied by wife, and I've counted them up, and out of about 55 engagements he's only attended about 7 with his wife. So he obviously rather likes going to these big lunches with.
You must lobby people like this.
Oh, I'm a lobbyist in my professional career for Insight PA, as you mentioned earlier, and it's perfectly right and proper that this is transparent. It's a sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't story.
Yeah, but what do you lobby these people for? You lobby them to try and do what your client wants them to do.
Well, I think it's a perfectly legitimate role for the lobbyist in British political life, and it's to inform, engage, discuss, and help sort of move the political agenda.
And bend their ear.
Well,
Why do you think it's called Sir Brian Bender?
Well, that's a wonderful name, isn't it?
Bent, left, right, and centre.
I mean, I hope
it's been wined and dined at huge and vast expense. And the point here is that you've got this guy who I'm sure has to make some very serious decisions, and it's not questioning whether or not he should be meeting these people. It's a question of whether or not the things that he's invited to are appropriate, because he is ultimately going to be making decisions about where vast sums of public money is spent. And what you want as a taxpayer is to make sure that the right contractor is providing the service, not the one who invites you to go to Wimbledon.
I completely agree with James on this, actually. He's absolutely right. What's happening at the moment is there is this sort of potential for a knee-jerk reaction from government. We've had the cash for clauses allegations in the last couple of weeks. We've had a government committee recommend there should be statutory regulation for lobbyists, and there is a fear amongst the lobbying community, certainly, that there'll be a knee-jerk reaction from government, that they will have heavy-handed regulation, and what's needed is a considered approach. And obviously
lobbyists like to play an underhand game. I mean, I know loads of lobbyists, and they like, as nice as they are, they like to be as underhand as they can possibly do if it
are you underhand?
Clients.
I was just saying that you're underhand. I'm not going to defend yourself.
Well, I may be under people's thumbs, but maybe my girlfriend's, has to be said. I'm under no one's hand. No, in fact, the lobbying industry tends to be quite prosaic. We tend to have a very sort of quite a formulaic way of doing things sometimes, and it's very much about doing things through the proper channels, meeting the right MPs. It's actually very much about building support from the bottom up and building that wide network of parliamentary support and getting things done the right way. And certainly that's what we do at Insight.
It's a shame there's so many mistakes made then.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, not like you to be controversial, James. It's time to move on to the front of the Independent. Geert Wilders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a fascinating story, because I think whichever way you look at it, here is an individual who, he is an elected MP in his own country, of course, Mr. Wilders, from Holland. He has some very radical views, and indeed he was barred from coming into this country as a result that his presence, for example, was perhaps thought to not only highlight tensions within communities, but also, I think, many people think that he was inciting religious hatred. So, of course, those views not to be encouraged. Now, the question is whether or not, within a society that is tolerant of people with different views, where you need to have freedom of speech. Was it right to ban this man, and then, or was it right to turn him away? Now you've got in the Independent here, you've got Chris Huhne, who says yes, it was right to turn him away, and he gives the argument that in a civilised society there has to be a dividing line between the right to freedom of speech and then when it topples over into incitement and hatred, and then that's where the line is drawn. Ed Hussein says no, it was wrong to ban him simply because tolerant Muslims, he said, must be allowed to show that we have strength of our convictions and are allowed to handle criticism in a robust way.
It's always interesting, isn't it, when you have Muslims who are meant to be the offended community by all of this saying, no, he should have been allowed in. I mean, it turns it on its head.
It does turn it on its head, and it's also a question. You see, Chris Huhne is making his comments on the basis that he's seen the film that he finds offensive. So therefore, he is able to make a judgment and say, well, no, I don't agree with it. But then most people of the British public don't know what this man stands for. They don't know how abhorrent his views may or may not be because they've never really heard of him before. And I think sometimes in order to formulate a view and to really instill our British dislike for people who incite this kind of thing, you've got to know what they're saying so that you know what you're reacting against.
My view of all this is that the reason the government banned him in the first place was because of the fear that he would incite religious hatred. Now, you can't incite religious hatred in a vacuum. You have to have someone who is doing the inciting and someone who responds. Now, it strikes me that you take a judgment with these things. Do you take the risk of banning him, which they did do, and then cause this huge media furore, which has happened when they've got front page headlines and all this stuff? Or do you sort of say, well, okay, he's going to have a limited audience, he's meeting 20 peers or whatever it was in the House of Commons, no one's going to hardly notice, we let it fall under the radar, and actually we sort of, we don't fan the flames of it. And I think whilst what he says is abhorrent, I've seen the stuff that's written down, I haven't seen the video, it sounds abhorrent, and what I'd like to see is the government, rather than just criticising him, actually extolling the virtues of the Quran and saying, actually the Quran is a peaceful text, it promotes peace between people, I don't
think you need a government to do that. I think people should be allowed to make up their own minds, and I think people from those particular communities, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the Quran or whether you're talking about the Bible or anything else, I think it's up to the religious leaders to be able to put forward their case in a society where we listen to all.
Well, I haven't heard any of our political masters in the last 24 hours backing the Muslim community as such. I've heard them bashing this chap, Geert Wilders. And also, I mean, the other issue is, can you really take someone seriously who's got sort of long, bleach blonde, hair? I mean, he looks a bit like sort of Malfoy from Harry Potter, doesn't he?
Well, I think we take him very seriously, obviously. I do think that it has, but the thing is, it never would have reached the front pages in the way that it has. It never would have been discussed as much had they not banned him, and I think sometimes it's better just to let insidious people make their comments and then go away.
I agree with you. And the thing is, he's actually doing exactly what the terrorists do, which is to take the Quran completely out of context and to completely misrepresent it, is what the people who...
But you're saying that when, again, you said you haven't seen the film. Well, isn't the danger that we are all jumping to conclusions and we don't actually know what we're talking about until we've seen it?
Well, what I've seen is the clips on your shows and elsewhere, and they clearly... it is insightful. But the question is, how insightful would it have been had the government not banned him from coming to the country? And I think it's very difficult to argue that the government's decision has done anything other than fan the flames of this debate.
Let's talk about another government decision in the Telegraph. I can imagine you want to get your teeth into this, James. The budget being April, so it gives Gordon a bit of time to play for. It's interesting, we always refer to Gordon with the budget when it should be Alistair Darling, shouldn't it?
It should be, but of course we all know that behind our Chancellor is a strong iron fist, I'm sure. And I still don't know why that no one's told Gordon Brown that when he's in the House of Commons and he starts clunking his fists around, there are microphones there, makes it terribly difficult to do. Stop it! Anyway, that's just my guidance. I'm trying to get a message across. If you're listening, Gordon, perhaps you'd like to take notes.
If you want a lobbyist, of course, to get that message through.
I'm not paying it, it's all right. I just made it here. I'm sure he's listening. Good old Gordon. The budget. This is what they've said. April the 22nd is the date. This is the latest date for a budget outside election years since 1945. And, of course, the Treasury playing it down, Alistair Darling saying, well, we're just, normal course of business. However, it is very clearly a political decision, and what most people will see this as is that Gordon Brown has had probably the most torrid week of his career to date. It really doesn't bode well well, and he's got to give himself some time, I think, to really set out what he's doing, allow some of the measures to come into place, because I don't think they even know how much money has been spent, how much money has gone out the door, and they've got to give themselves as long as possible to prepare. But I'm afraid for the nation, it means that we've got to wait and hear their next budgetary plans, and I wonder if they're going to be as good as the 2.5 percentage point cut in VAT that was so effective.
I have to say, it does smack a little